Jingchao Ma from Villanova University, and it is my honor to moderate the panel. So like the previous one, we're going to have 3 presentations, and then we have about half an hour for all questions.
This is very optimistic.
Hopefully. So let's. So the first presenter, Miglena Nikolchina, is professor at the Department of Theory and History of Literature at Sofia University, Bulgaria. Her publications in English include Matricide in Language, Writing Theory in Kristeva and Wolf, and Lost Unicorns of the Velvet Revolutions, Heterotopia of the Seminar. Her current research projects address humanist, anti-humanist theoretical trends through fictions of the artificial creatures. Let's give.
Okay, thank you so much. So I do have a book on Kristeva which deals with issues like the ones we discussed in the previous session. So it's the Abject, it's Matricide, it's female subjectivity and issues like this. But I have recently moved to an altogether different perspective, so I'm not sure how much you would find it interesting, but it's connected to the communist past. So it emerged in my previous text where I treat Kristeva in conjunction with a Bulgarian novelist whom she mentions in Murder in Byzantium, and this novelist, some years ago it turned out, she also wrote a book on Anna Komnina, so this is what connects the 2 authors, and Kristeva mentions her. But it turned out that this novelist, she was a secret services informer, so we have this past, communist past, with these secret personas of public figures, of intellectuals, which is, I believe, it's important, and it's not that we have all these years, and I think it's only now beginning, this clearance of the vestiges of this past. So here I'm doing something similar. And besides, it's also part of something I've been doing lately because I work in a department where all the young colleagues became obsessed with the problem of the double, so they are writing and thinking about doppelgangers all the time. So I said, okay, you're doing doubles and I'm doing couples. So I started working through coupling, and coupling of intellectuals, it's nicer if they did have something biographical between them, as in the case I wrote recently a piece on the well-known French philosopher Louis Althusser, and not so very well-known but very interesting Georgian Russian philosopher Merat Mamardashvili. So this type of coupling, and I'm doing it to a certain extent again. So my idea is that the couple can produce a similar uncanny effect like the double. So if you meet 2 thinkers, 2 intellectuals, or maybe some other different 2 figures, this encounter, this meeting can produce a sort of lightning, like what happens with doppelgangers and with doubles. So I begin first with a fictional, but it's actually a quasi-fictional couple, which appears in Kristeva's novel The Samurai, Olga and Dan. Dan is a character in this novel. He arrives in Paris from an unnamed communist country. Sometime before him, Olga Morena, the protagonist of the novel, has arrived from the self-same country and then forgotten to go back, and this was punishable. Dan is represented as an intellectual, an erudite, a polyglot with a Rabelisian appetite for literature and culture. Dan's goal is to try to convince Olga to return to her country. They used to be lovers, and Dan saw her off when she was leaving, but he does not rely on amorous arguments. His arguments are theoretical and political. There are two things he cannot stand, he says, submission and technique. In his own country, people are too submissive. In the West, they are technicians, so it's all wrong. He's against both. When Olga notes that so-called technicians in the West are politically active, furious critics of the authorities, and this meeting takes place most probably in the summer of 1966, so it's shortly, political events of 1968 are already brewing in Paris. He answers, it's just a game. They protest because they're quite safe. You've lost the sense of death, both as a threat and as a motivating force. Olga is not impressed by such arguments and then goes back without her. Before this, however, he has turned into a figure providing the key to the novel's title. In spite of their splitting up and in spite of their refusal to admit it, Olga and Dan share a common utopia, the utopia of writing as a martial art, of the conviction that there was no better way of acting, and I'm quoting, before, in, and after death, than joining together the art of war and the art of writing. This utopia found its way in Dan's book, so Kristeva goes on for some time about this book, which is about a Japanese samurai, Yamamoto, who, for whatever reasons, there was a prohibition of this, did not commit suicide, as usually samurais do, but instead chose writing. So writing is, in a way, equal to suicide. And Kristeva says that writing becomes something like a repeated suicide. Dan, among other things, says also that although he is communicating with the regime back at home, he says Yamamoto's parable, which is supposedly his book, reminds us that there are some compromises that are not surrenders. One is called writing, the kind where the writer risks his job and his life. Dan makes another appearance in the novel when Olga learns about his premature death. This death from unsuccessful surgery of peritonitis is, Olga comments, natural and therefore dull. And I find it funny because it's not funny really, but maybe a couple of years after the samurai, Kristeva's own father died from the same, with the same diagnosis and the same unsuccessful surgery, and then she thought it was a sort of conspiracy by the communist regime, and he was the victim of some terrible experimentation and so on and so forth, although her father was twice the age of Dan at the time when this happened. Now, it is not a secret that most of the characters in the samurai are recognizable historical figures from Kristeva's Parisian milieu, and among them Roland Barthes, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Benveniste, a lot of Philippe Soulers, Lacan, Derrida. Olga Morena is one of the two characters in the novel who represent Julia Kristeva herself. Olga is not simply a Slavic name, fitting the unspecified Slavic fatherland of the protagonist. This is also the name of Simone de Beauvoir's Ukrainian lover, a student and then lover, who became a figure in both Beauvoir's and Sartre's novels. So she also connects in this way to Simone de Beauvoir's novel The Mandarins, making her samurai a sort of second edition of the Mandarins. But there is also an additional moment because the family name of her protagonist, Morena, is the Slavonic goddess of death. So this combination, Olga, which is in its origin, it's a Scandinavian name meaning sacred and death, makes the name of the protagonist also relevant to the idea of writing as a repeated suicide and this kind of martial art. Now, Dan is a Bulgarian writer, literary critic, theoretical and theoretician. His name is Cvetan Stoyanov, and he was really Julia Kristeva's lover before she left for Paris. So there is this little biographical intrigue in this, and it's most certain that he did go to Paris to try to have her go back. The question is, what is the novel or the literary work which Kristeva might be envisioning when she speaks about Dan's novel? And here I go into my second couple, which I have to represent very quickly. It's a fictional couple, and it's a couple we could say it's an intertextual couple, because it's a couple formed by Voltaire's protagonist Candide and the protagonist of one of Cvetan Stoyanov's novels, which was published at this time. So the title of Stoyanov's novel is The Exceptional Biography of Budi Budev, and this is the novel about a Bulgarian writer who is forced out of his paradise, very much like Candide is. So like Candide, he lives in a sort of castle where he's very happy, and he is in love, and everything seems okay. But then the communists come, and he's forced to leave the country. I'm telling the story a little bit very quickly. And like Candide, he has a very funny teacher. Candide's teacher is Pangloss, and it's a parody of Leibniz's idea of pre-established harmony. So this is the idea which Candide has to test by wandering the world. And with Budi Budev, this teacher is an Armenian named Marduk, and Marduk is the Babylonian god of all gods. So it's the supreme Babylonian god, but clearly the idea is this is the god of polyglotism and of world literature. So the idea which Budi Budev tries to test, subjects to an experiment by wandering the world, is the idea of Goethe's idea of world literature. And although Goethe is never really mentioned in the novel, Cvetan Stoyanov has an essay on Goethe in which he says that Goethe's ideal of world literature is threatened by three major obstacles. Number one, empty universalism. Number two, military, political, economical conflicts of all sorts, which have as their result isolationism, so they lead to isolation. And number three is commercialized exoticism. So if you want to, for example, to be a Balkan writer, you have to play Balkan. And in Bulgaria this was very much discussed because Serbians were very good always at this. They were very good at always playing the Balkan subject, and if you haven't read the novels, you have probably seen any of Kusturica's films or heard this music. So they always were very good at selling this Balkan subjectivity to the world, and the Bulgarians we can't. Somehow we're not good, and it's not working. It's never working. So poor Budi, he writes a book. He finishes the book, in which he tries to say things that are important for the world. So for everybody in the world, they're important globally. They're important internationally. They're important both in communist countries and in countries which are not communist, in the West, in the democratic, everywhere. So it's the tragedy of the epoch. But he wants to tell this truth about things from a specific position, from his position as a Bulgarian who, he believes, can see certain things better. From his marginalized position, there is a certain visibility which is absent from if you're in the center. If you're in the margin, you can see a little bit better certain things, and he wants to show the world this truth. Now, all this ends rather terribly for poor Budi, because the only people whom he succeeds in making interested in his work are, number one, a publisher in Vienna who owns a publishing house fittingly called Universal Publishing House, and who is very knowledgeable about psychoanalysis and certain other things, and who turns out to be completely mad. So this is number one. Number two is an existentialist bum who lives under the bridges in Paris. So this is because when Budi arrives in Paris, he's immediately pickpocketed and he loses all his money. So he has to share the life of Paris bums, but they're very interested in his ideas, so he can discuss them with them. And then a third case is in Africa, because he also at some point is in Africa, and there he finds an African leader who has a very hard time maneuvering between the French and the Algerian revolutionaries, because it's in the 50s. Algeria is not yet an independent country. So this African leader turns out, in the end, he admits that he has a secret library. So it's a secret, huge philosophical library. He doesn't want people to see it because they will lose their respect for him. So it's so these are the three persons. It's a much longer novel with a lot of heavy political satire in it, and a lot of very funny erotic escapades which Budi has, but altogether his idea fails. And like Candide, he has to go back, and if Candide reaches the maxim that one should work one's garden, then Budi's maxim is, he's not very happy, but he becomes a librarian. So if he didn't succeed as a very great writer, then at least he can try to be an educator. And here I go, now the problem is, what could such a novel say to a rising star like Kristeva? Because what it says is you either give up on your initial ideas about what you want to write and what you want to give to the world in terms of thinking, and then maybe you have a chance to become part of world literature, or you simply go back home and you become a teacher to the young children. There seems to be no way between these options. There is, however, a darker addendum to this. And this is my last couple. It's a biographical couple, clear and simple. In 1971, the beginning of 1971, so a few years after this visit to Paris to see Kristeva, the same author, Tsvetan Stoyanov, met with another émigré Bulgarian writer. I don't know whether you've heard about the Bulgarian umbrella. In the UK, I think everybody has heard. So the Bulgarian umbrella was an umbrella which ended with a sort of weapon which contained ricin, so the very powerful and unrecognizable poison. And there was this Bulgarian emigre writer, Georgi Markov, who died some years later. He was assassinated with this umbrella. So our author, Tsvetan Stoyanov, met him in London again, trying to convince him to go back home. And in this case, it is quite certain that they were friends on the one hand, but on the other hand, Tsvetan Stoyanov was really fulfilling a task from the Bulgarian secret services. He was not successful, again, as in the case with Kristeva. He went back home, and 6 months later he was dead from this mysterious unsuccessful surgery. And a few months later, his surgeon was also dead, again in unclear circumstances. So there is this huge question about indeed the tragedy of this writer and his struggle, and finally I don't have to really do it, but he introduced in his late writing the concept of non-coinciding coincidences. So he was indeed fulfilling, maybe in the case of Kristeva there is no record, but certainly in the case of Georgi Markov, he was fulfilling a task from the secret services, but I believe he also sincerely wanted these people to go back because he believed that the system could be changed from within. And in order to do so, he needed allies, he needed people who would work to do this. And here, I'll stop here.
To read the title of this presentation. I only have 2 jobs and I failed to do one. And it's Olga and Dan, the threads that were cut. And next, we're having Julia Sushytska from Pacifica Graduate Institute. Her areas of expertise are ancient Greek and 20th century continental philosophy. Her research focuses on convergences between ideas of ancient Greek philosophers, especially of Parmenides, Heraclitus, and Plato, and the work of 20th century thinkers, in particular Gilles Deleuze, Alain Badiou, and Julia Kristeva. She also published several essays on the philosophical notion of Eastern Europe and on the films of Andrei Tarkovsky.
Thank you. What I will try to do, if technology cooperates, is show you some images while I'm speaking and then make a connection between my talk and the images. So the images are actually from the recent events in Ukraine, and some of them probably will look familiar, maybe some of them you will recognize. So they will be seemingly disconnected from what I'm saying until the very end. And I want to preface my talk with a quotation from Miglena Nikolchina, actually from the book that appeared in English some time ago, Matricidal Language. The voice of marginality tends to be perceived as an oscillation between the inaudible and the vulgar. We always seem to have too much or too little of the marginal. In either case, we cannot hear it. So there's another quotation from Gloria Anzaldua's book, Borderlands, La Frontera. Something is trying to tell me, that voice at the edge of things. And finally, something that has been actually used as a preface, I believe, in the text of Slavoj Žižek. It's actually a quote from an anonymous author. An enemy is someone whose story you have not heard. So keeping this in mind, let me start the talk and the slideshow, and hopefully it will work by itself. Let's see. So these 3 quotations will guide my presentation today. While I speak about the Metics, or resident aliens, right? The Metic is the ancient Greek term for a resident alien. So those who are in between 2 or more cultures, languages, ethnicities, I will show you images from a place that has a long history of being in between social and political systems, languages and cultures, a place in which I was raised, Ukraine. I would like to continue thinking through one of the most far-reaching concepts brought to our attention by Julia Kristeva, and that's the concept of the stranger to ourselves. And I want to consider it in the light of the following remark made by Kristeva in the book Nations Without Nationalism. It is time, she writes, in an open letter to Harlem Desir, to ask immigrant people what motivated them, apart from economic opportunities, to abandon their place of origin and move to another place. This comment sparked much criticism, yet what Kristeva suggests is, I believe, a necessary condition for re-envisioning the way we speak and live with others. So in the interest of time, I will not focus on the arguments of Kristeva's critics, but instead, what I will do, I'll attempt to think together with Kristeva and suggest one possible way to go beyond this comment to strengthen it actually. So my approach is consistent with the idea that I will introduce today, the idea that conversations allow us to evolve, to become different from ourselves. So you're probably all familiar with Kristeva's famous idea of the stranger to ourselves. I don't know if I need to briefly summarize it or not, right? So all of us are strangers to ourselves, and this is the idea that Kristeva traces to Freud and changes it or applies it to foreigners and immigrants, those who have come in from the outside, right? Okay, so what I also want to bring in today into the discussion is Gloria Anzaldúa, who is writing from a different intellectual tradition. She calls the stranger to ourselves, she calls it the beast. So in her book Borderlands, La Frontera, she emphasizes that we must engage with this beast, so similar to Kristeva. And because if left to its own devices, it will tear us apart. But if we begin a conversation with it, and it's actually a word that Anzaldúa uses, a conversation, if we converse with it, it will give us the power to recreate ourselves and the world. Anzaldúa's own conversation with her beast, and that appears in this book, is both terrifying and beautiful, much like the beast itself. Several aspects of her discussion of this conversation will allow me to develop my definition of the metic, or the stranger who decided to stay in a given place. So, as I mentioned, Kristeva suggests that it is time to ask immigrants what motivated them, apart from economic opportunities, to abandon their place of origin and to move to a new place. And some of Kristeva's critics pointed out that asking this question will further reinforce the inequality of the already oppressive situation in which the stranger finds herself. However, most of these kind of concerns vanish if we clarify that what we have in mind is, first of all, a self-questioning. What motivates me? What am I looking for? What is my desire? Given this, I think that the idea that it's time to ask the immigrant no longer harbors the shadow of a reproach. It is no longer a demand that the immigrant justifies herself. Instead, it invites the stranger to articulate her desires and concerns, to voice her differences, to tell her story, and to enter a conversation in the course of which she has an opportunity to be heard and to hear the so-called autochthonous host. So, of course, the question about one's desires, much like the famous why at the beginning of Aristotle's Metaphysics, can be asked only once the basic needs have been satisfied. This means that it cannot be asked by an immigration officer, or at the moment when the stranger is struggling to find food and shelter, or is threatened with deportation. The host must create conditions for this conversation, allocate financial resources, make available a place, for instance, a gallery space, a lecture hall, a community center, for artistic performances and philosophical discussions. It will not be difficult to secure the funding and the venues once the autochthon realizes that the stranger's presence is absolutely crucial to his own well-being. Not merely his economic, but also his psychological well-being and the well-being of the polis or the state. And I can talk about why this is the case. I do have an argument for it, but I'm going to move on now to the next point. So my first point is that to ask the immigrant means, first of all, to invite the self-questioning. My second point is that the self-questioning must be mutual. Just as it is important for the stranger to inquire into her desire, including the desire for new roots, it is crucial that the autochthon asks himself what makes him a stranger to his own land. That is, why he is not an autochthon. And such questioning, to be sure, is deeply rooted in the ancient Greek quest of knowing thyself, and some might claim is therefore suspect as a master's tool. This tool, however, can be subverted once we specify in the spirit of Kristeva that to know thyself is to know thyself as another, or once we clarify in the spirit of Anzaldúa that to know thyself is, quote, to know thyself as an animal, a woman, a homosexual, an outcast, a foreigner, end quote. In other words, to engage in the questioning incited by the stranger's presence is to engage in self-questioning that reveals the autochthon in the stranger and the stranger in the autochthon. So it's mutual. I want to make one more point to suggest that this conversation is not, or must not be viewed as oppressive, potentially only oppressive. So it might be objected that such questioning is nevertheless disadvantageous to the stranger. From the legal and economic points of view, conversations between the autochthon and the stranger always happen on an equal footing. It would be overly simplistic, however, to assume that one of the participants is unambiguously the oppressed and the other the oppressor. For the forces out of which each encounter is weaved are the multitude. And one of them in particular can dramatically change the configuration of forces that constitute this encounter between the stranger and the host. Whatever the disadvantages of the stranger's situation, she has one clear advantage over the autochthon. The stranger has access to what Anzaldúa calls the deep understanding of the world. And the term deep takes us back not only to the ancient Aztec mythology, and this is what Anzaldúa talks about, but also to the myths of ancient Greece, or what is considered to be the origins of Western civilization, for instance. The stranger has direct experience of the primordial darkness, out of which both light and dark emerge, this is the Aztec mythology, or of the originary chaos of Hesiod's theogony, as well as the process of differentiation through which new beings emerge from this darkness and chaos. The Metics' deep understanding comes from her awareness of the abyss that serves as the foundation for any specific place. The Metic stands on the threshold of several places and is an internal outsider to all of them. And elsewhere, when I talk more about this, I call this the Metics metis, right, another Greek term for a certain kind of knowledge that is not reducible either to practical intelligence or to theoretical, intellectual understanding that Western culture prioritizes. So there's a certain kind of understanding that is more easily accessible to the strangers. And I have, let's see, 5 more minutes? Something like that? 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, good.
Start 5 minutes.
So, to quote again from Anzaldúa, she says that those who are the most ostracized for being different, quote, have it the strongest. The females, the homosexuals of all races, the dark-skinned, the outcast, the persecuted, the foreign, and, end quote. And the pain and fear that makes these people develop the sense is not really the only reason for this sense, right? So there is a deeper meaning to this metis, what I call metis or understanding, and that's meaning that is developed when the stranger decides to engage with her own strangeness. So basically what I'm trying to say is that a lot of people who, especially those who are outcasts of different kinds and strangers, have access to this deep understanding, but to really engage with it is yet a different kind of activity, and that's how I define the metic. The internal outsider is the one who consciously develops this sense. So in other words, this is not something automatic, and at the same time, this allows for the possibility of those who are not literal strangers to become metics, right? So somebody who is not oppressed socially, economically, ethnically, and so on, can gain access to this understanding, but that requires a lot of work, including the work that has to be done in confronting his or her own privilege, right? So being the medic is a continuous process. It doesn't have a final point. And it means continuously deepening the understanding of the abyss that underlies every being and every structure. Being the medic means time after time looking in the eyes of her beast and seeing in them both ugliness and beauty. And I want to quote from Anzaldúa again. She writes, "How does one put feathers on this particular serpent?" And she adds that only few are able to notice tenderness on the beast's face. So seeing beauty in what is commonly viewed as ugliness, right? So seeing beauty in what is commonly heard as vulgar. It is just as important, however, to learn how to prune those parts of the beast that are threatening to compromise the creative, active forces of this understanding or metis. Sometimes, tells us Anzaldúa, she puts, quote, imagination to a more rare use. I choose words, images, and bodily sensations and animate them to impress them on my consciousness, thereby making changes in my belief system and reprogramming my consciousness, end quote. This involves confronting the different forms her shadow beast takes and then deciding, and this is again quoting from her, which I want from my psyche. Those I don't want, I starve. I feed them no words, no images, no feelings. I spend no time with them, share not my home with them. Neglected, they leave. This is harder to do than to merely generate stories. I can only sustain this activity for a few minutes, end quote. So conversations with our own others make us realize that not everything in us is worth keeping. And I think this is the point also that Kristeva is making in the same letter. So this is something that she's suggesting and for which she has been criticized, right? So not everything that the stranger brings with her will or should become a part of a new place, just like not everything that is a part of the pre-existing place will become a new one. Learning to discern what is and what is not worth keeping involves listening to many different stories, even those that seem vulgar. Self-questioning begins conversations with a stranger, conversations that are much more than rational discussions, and the rich, although mostly forgotten meaning of the word conversation attests to it. Apart from logos, or rational discussions, conversations encompass creative, artistic activity, as well as the intimacy of living with others, sharing with them time and place. And if you look at the dictionary definitions, some of these meanings are obsolete, but they are there in the word conversation. Conversations also include a turning of bodies and minds, a revolution that is an evolution, and actually the word has as its root the Latin conversionem, right, to turn. So this is the kind of meaning that I'm suggesting that is at the core of this idea of asking the immigrant, right? It's to ask an immigrant is much more than to just question them, right? It involves this kind of conversation that goes beyond merely talking. When the stranger and the autochthon engage in a conversation with themselves and with each other, with themselves as another and with another as themselves, the medic emerges. The one who tells her story in a loud voice, abandoning the fear of being vulgar, who pollutes a major language with mistakes that upon touching ears or pages turn into poems, birds, beasts, who listens to the autochthon story and notices in it that which has never been heard before. And today we're witnessing a vivid example of this painful and beautiful becoming when we look at what's happening with the people of Ukraine right now. So I want to point very briefly only several aspects of this process, and if you like we can continue discussing it in more detail. So here's the parallel between my talk and the events and the images. Ukraine has been Europe's and the West's internal stranger, Metic, long before it became an independent country. And it has a long history, in fact, of being an internal stranger. Today, in light of the 3 months of protests that brought down the corrupt government of Yanukovych, in light of the military occupation of Crimea and of the continued threat of a military invasion from the Russian Federation, it is more evident than ever how important this internal stranger polis, Ukraine, is for Europe and more generally for the West. And I do not mean important economically or geopolitically, but insofar as the people of Ukraine reveal what Western civilization is, what it is not, and what how this civilization can become different. Ukrainian people began the excruciatingly painful but also beautiful and life-giving process of questioning themselves. They began it by themselves, not prompted by the West and the money behind it, as some individuals think in the West, especially this idea has circulated in the West. They stood up and spoke out, and in doing so, changed who they are. They became different from themselves already. This is already the case. This act of becoming different makes Ukraine European in the sense, or Western, in the sense in which contemporary Europe is only infrequently European. The people of Ukraine began speaking their minds in this Maidan, the square in Kiev, but also many other different squares, public spaces. They began thinking for themselves, and they also stood up for each other, for specific others, sometimes vastly different from them. As a result, what it means to be Ukrainian is taking on an entirely different significance. Historical events are being reappropriated, subverted, and given new meaning in the past few weeks, or as we speak now. For instance, it becomes increasingly clear that ethnic, linguistic, cultural differences no longer separate the people of this country. The myth of Ukraine divided into the pro-European West and pro-Russian East vanished in a matter of days. And here, just a couple of examples. So the east of Ukraine, the city of Donetsk, the so-called stronghold of pro-Russian forces, is actually seen unprecedented number of people walk out on the street carrying what they claim to be the biggest Ukrainian flag. So this is the famous image of Eisenstein's Potemkin staircase, right, that has been given a new meaning by the following protest, again, kind of unprecedented for the southern city of Odessa, to see this number of people who have never, many of whom have never embraced any of the symbols that they're carrying here before. And this is, again, a protest in Kharkiv, and some of the protesters carrying, I think, a very significant, very deep slogans. You know, I am a Russian, my motherland is Ukraine, and even more prominently here, I'm a Russian, I speak Russian, I want to live in Ukraine. I'm a Moldavian, I speak Russian, I want to live in Ukraine. So something is important is happening, I think, right now in Ukraine then that can tell the Western culture what it should be or what it is, maybe in some kind of deep sense, right? This depth that is not available to those who don't occupy a marginal position, as you were saying, right? So again, this idea that difference, internal difference, doesn't need to be erased, but at the same time, it will not separate me from the other who's different, right? So this is just very briefly about the significance of Ukraine, and if you want, we can talk about this further. And then finally, this kind of slogan. Okay, thank you very much.
Finally, we have with us Kamelia Spassova. She is a senior assistant professor in comparative literature in the Department of Theory and History of Literature at Sofia University. Recently, she published a book based on her PhD dissertation, Event and Example in Plato and Aristotle, which deals with the tension between literary examples and exemplary works in philosophical and theoretical research. Together with Maria Kalinova, she is working on a theoretical project doubles as Uncanny Figures in Literature. The title of her presentation today is Abject versus Uncanny Strangeness.
Hello, I'm extremely glad to be here, to be part of the Kristeva circle. And what is probably strange is that I'm not feeling stranger here. First, the ground of the human and the semiotic gap. In this paper, I will evoke Heidegger's conceptualization of the ground of the human in order to demonstrate the manner in which the idea of uncanny strangeness in Kristeva's Strangers to Ourselves stayed in both Freud's and Heidegger's tradition. Next, I'll explore the manner in which Kristeva transforms Freud's concepts of the uncanny and of libido in her theory of the abject and of female libido. And finally, I will outline the paradox of the political subject through the structure of relations in Antigone. By way of approaching the splitting trajectory of the notion of the subject in Kristeva's theory, I will first turn to the two famous lines from Antigone, Polata deina kuden, anthropo deinuteran pere. The chorus brings the question of what is a human, or more precisely, it gives an answer to the question in the form of the comparative adjective, deinuteron. The problem is how to translate the adjective, deinuteron, from the choral odes Epiphany. The task of the translator reveals the semiotic gaps opened up by ambivalence of the words, meaning as both wonderful and monstrous, or beastful. The authoritative translation in English by David Green of this passage is, many are the wonders, none is more wonderful than what is man. This translation corresponds to the mainstream translations in many other European languages. Heidegger, however, questions this rendition. In his seminar on the Richter, discussing Hölderlin's translation and his commentaries on Antigone, Heidegger explains that the polysemia of the Greek word todenus includes something which is simultaneously fearful, powerful, and violent. He suggests the translation of deinos through the German word das Unheimliche, the uncanny. Many hold is the uncanny, yet nothing more uncanny looms or stirs beyond the human being. And the translation suggests. So, multiple is the uncanny, but the most uncanny is the human. Defined with Heidegger, the uncanny strangeness as a ground of the human, we put human being on an unstable ground. Heidegger's observation on the translation of Deinus as unheimlich provides a possible introduction to the problem of uncanny strangeness. The unheimlich as a ground of human nature describes this nature as simultaneously powerful and violent, wonderful and monstrous, familiar and alien. In her book on Hannah Arendt, Kristeva addresses explicitly Heidegger's unheimlich and its, quote, anguish symptomatic of pure foreignness, that radical forsaken aloneness that follows from being thrown into the world. This passage, which echoes ideas elaborated before that in Strangers to Ourselves, allow us to read Heidegger's translation as prefiguring Kristeva's thesis in Strangers to Ourselves, that the foreign is not outside the human, but inside it. In this book, Kristeva examines the intertwining of uncanniness and foreignness, a mirror reflection of the foreign in the polis and of the alien within the kernel of the self. The figure of political strangeness could be further told in accordance with Hannah Arendt and Kristeva as that of a human totally expelled from the community, polis, and state. Quote from Hannah Arendt, the abstract nakedness of being human, and nothing but human. 2. Abjection, the language of female libido. Strangers to ourselves has two major dimensions. It is an investigation into the political implication of strangeness and a profound reflection on the strangeness inherent in human nature. The book examines this uncanny strangeness diachronically, starting with the barbarian and the Metics in the classical age and in Greek tragedy, and reaching to the modern age and the Freudian essay Das Unheimliche. Kristeva defines the theoretical frame of uncanny strangeness by a close reading of Freud's essay, concluding that death, the feminine, and the drives are the topos of the uncanny. The psychoanalytical debates between Freud and Jung precede Heidegger's phenomenology of Das Unheimliche, but the pursuits of Heidegger and Freud are made compatible in Kristeva's book. Her double strategy, as precisely described by Kelly Oliver, is, quote, to bring the subject into the place of the other by putting the other into the subject, end of quote. It should be noted that this inflection of the logic of symbolic identification and the body is played around an already established boundary between sameness and otherness. This is not the case with another of Kristeva's key concepts, abjection. The concept of abjection is parallel to the uncanny, but essentially different from it, insofar as it tries to articulate processes beyond the symbolic and language, before the boundary between sameness and difference has been established. The contrast between abject and uncanny strangeness has this concrete side effect, which could be seen from this perspective of literary theory. It is possible to distinguish between the female and male doubles in literary works. It is this effect that will concern here. In psychoanalytical terms, the doppelganger figure is usually investigated through the Freudian concept of the uncanny. The uncanny effect, or affect, emerged in Freud's explanation in connection with repetition, which leads Freud to the conclusion: there is not one drive, but there are two, eros and kainetos. The dead drive, on the other hand, brings Kristeva to the conclusion: there is not one libido only, there are two, male and female. This distinction makes it possible to differentiate between abject and uncanny doubles, which in its turn allows reaching out beyond the pleasure principle towards repetition and the dead drive as they are played out in confronting otherness. Kristeva modifies Freud's theory on the uncanny with regard to the precondition of narcissism. Kristeva's theory of the object and objection is based on a precondition of narcissism, or a kind of narcissistic crisis, hence a crisis of uncanny strangeness. Quote from Powers of Horror: essentially different from uncanniness, more violent too, abjection is elaborated through a failure to recognize its kin. Nothing is familiar, not even the shadow of a memory. Miglena Nikolchina's book, Matricide in Language, offers a profound analysis on Kristeva's theorization of abjection. Her reflection on the abject unfold in the direction of Kristeva's notion of female libido, grounded as it is on Freud's investigation on the death drive. The Freudian term libido as male only, and Kristeva term female libido, as Nikolchina emphasizes, are not, quote, from her book, approachable from any gender position. Male libido and female libido pertain to a typology of looks and not to a typology of bodies. What is the demarcation line between male and female libido? Structurally, the most important differentiation between male and female libido pertains to the fact that the first one is objectless, while the second one is driven by an object of desire. The female libido operates at the stage of objection, in the blurry zone where each boundary is uncertain. As Kelly Oliver points out, objection is, quote, the realization that the primary identification with the mother is a seeming, a fake. For Kristeva, it is the separation before the beginning, end of quote. So the language of the female libido is reduplication before the beginning, before the symbolic order, before the construction of logic and logical instruments which can arrange the phenomena on the axis of time and space and create differences through science. Quote from Blackson: reduplication is a gent repetition, while what is repeated is rippled out in time. Reduplication lies outside time. It is a reverberation in space, a play of mirrors, lacking perspective or duration. The object is not yet subject, not yet object. It precedes the subject-object dialectic. Therefore, the female libido is constituted without object, and even without a narcissistic object. And hence, it is a libido without desire. It is a paradoxical structure operated by the death drive. In contrast to the male libido oriented toward the paternal figure, as in castration complex and the Oedipal triangle, the female libido is oriented toward the archaic mother, or pre-narcissistic mother-child dyad. The temporality of the female libido is not chronological. It is a historical rupture, or a rupture before history. In Kristeva words, the time of objection is double, a time of oblivion and thunder, a veiled infinity, and the moment when revelation bursts forth. The space of the female libido is the non-space of the semiotic hora, the strange receptacle of all beings, which gives birth to the universal and abstract philosophical order of Plato's ideas and unchanging forms. But in Kristeva, this is the atopia of the mother body and the semiotic language. In the theoretical works of Kristeva, the real change and prefiguring of Freudian discourse is that even though the female libido is functioning before the symbolic order, it has its own language. The language of the female libido is the language that should be called a primary reduplication. The male libido presupposes the dialectic of sameness and otherness, the castration complex and the Oedipal triangle, the paternal figure, the object of desire, history, symbolic language, and the logic of representation. The female libido, in contrast, is conceptualized in terms of the reduplication between the same and the same, ex homoion. And here's the logic of analogic can be bring the narcissistic crisis, the abject mother, the abject, lacking space, hora, and lacking time, a flash, semiotic language, and the void within representation. These operators of differentiation could be used to separate male from female doubles in literary works. 3. The state of objection. Returning to the tragedy of Antigone, I will not revisit Tina Chanta's question who's Antigone. Neither will I repeat Judith Butler's Antigone claims, nor I will address Alain Badiou's statement that, quote, from Hegel to Lacan, the reference point for ethics is Sophokian. Who is Antigone? That is the question, end quote. For the time being, I will also defer a more careful examination of Julia Kristeva's own repeated returns to this figure. My goal at this point is to insert the problem of the abject type of reduplication in the diverging paths of psychoanalytical discussion of Antigone. To do so, I will map 4 types of couples in the tragedy, with 2 of them seen as resulting from uncanny reduplication, and there are Polynesius and Eteocles, and Antigone and Ismene, that is uncanny reduplication, and 2 as involving abject reduplication, Antigone and Polynesius, and Antigone and Creon. I will hence examine these couples as doubles driven by the logic of representation in the case of Uncanny, and in the second case by the forces of objection. And so, Polynesius and Eteocles can be defined as uncanny doubles. The battle between brothers is an aegon for authority after the death of the father. It takes place in Oedipian configuration, and their father certainly is peculiar. He's literally Oedipus. The conflict is a paradigmatic fratricide. Instead of producing the society of brotherhood, both brothers are dead. They are not inscribed in death in the same manner. While one of them is buried as a hero, the other one is excluded from the polis. The law of Creon seeks to separate the brothers in death in order to draw the borderline of the polis between insiders, citizens within the polis, like Eteocles, and outsider, like Polynesius, foreigners against the polis. Eteocles is on the side of memory, history, and representation, while Polynesius is on the side of oblivion. The logic of secure discrimination also separates the sister within the play. There is a crucial differentiation between Antigone and Ismene. The first one is driven by death. The other one is on the side of life. So paradoxically, the 2 sisters can be also unrevealed as uncanny doubles. Who is the object in Antigone? From the very beginning of the play, the corpse of Polynesius places an object as the center of the dramatic action. He is dead, a cadaver excluded from the polis, since Creon's law forbids this corpse to be buried. He is not represented as a sublime object as Eteocles is. He is an outcast, a deject from the polis. Polynesius is not a foreigner within their world. His exile is in death, and so the couple of Antigone and Polynesius could be seen as producing abject redoubling. They were sheltered by one womb by birth, and they strive for a common tone. The obsession of Antigone with the dead brother is an obsession with an object. She clearly articulates her preference to the dead brother rather than Hymen as her supposed object of desire. The crisis of the polis, or the moment when revelation bursts forth, is the unpresented deed of Antigone. Her act is not only aesthetical, not purely ethical, but a political gesture. Antigone incorporates the abject body within the polis, thus subverting the law nomos of Creon. The fundamental law of Creon is author, because Antigone inscribes the object brother in the body of the polis. The act is from her void position, a position which lacks of representation, but it is a political act. She buries her brother, and Polynesius is not anymore an object. He becomes a hero worthy of commemoration. As a result, however, Antigone herself becomes an object. The sovereign declares that those who transgresses this prohibition would be punished by death by public stoning. Any member of this community could kill the transgressor without any consequences. This is the paradoxical point of the tragedy, the zone where each boundary is uncertain. The double bind of both Antigone and Creon relies on the state of objection and the moment of discontinuity. The act of Antigone subverts the law of Creon, but the law of Creon excludes Antigone from the city, entombing her as a living dead and thus turning her into an object. The paradox is that it is from this position of objection that Antigone triumphs. From Creon, it is frightening, and in the play it is Denos, unheimlich, to change his mind and to alter his woe, but he does so. He buries Polynesius and resigns his order in the end of the play. The gesture of Antigone involves the ethic of negative sublimation. Her figure is a political figure in a state of objection. Her act is the moment of discontinuity, the rupture beyond representation. She is not simply a self-destructive woman. She opens new possibility for rethinking political subjectivity by subverting the political law from a stand in the void.
Thanks for a wonderful panel. Actually, I have a question about the relationship between the last two papers, particularly because Antigone she pulls us up a metic at the end of the play, so I'm wondering how that kind of might play into Camille's very interesting reading of the uncanny abject couple, because I don't know whether that, how you might think that in relationship to how Antigone is incorporating or inhabiting this abject role, which is also politicized in some way, because it seems like it has an interesting connection with her resident alien status in some sense. So just a speculative thought.
I can say a couple of words. Actually, my interest in Metics started started at the same time as my interest with Antigone being a Metic, and I actually worked on this issue. So I think it's a very good point of relevant connection. But I think, at least as the way that I tried to kind of reconceptualize Metic as this process of becoming different, right? The way I see Antigone is somebody who is an internal stranger, who is a stranger to the polis, which is her home, right? But who does not make a step that would help her do something with this difference, right? To transform this difference into something else, into something different, right? So my idea of the Metic, I think, is aimed at that, to see how these forces can be engaged in the process of creation, which is painful, but ultimately I think it is life-giving, and that's something that I think Antigone doesn't do. She realizes that she's a stranger, she's an internal stranger, struggles with it, but then she falls short of producing a new language or coming up with a new language, to put it that way. Unlike, for instance, and I know I'm comparing a fictional character to a historical figure, Anzaldúa, right, who does, as a result of the struggle, come up with a new language. Right? So this is what I see, but I'm sure you can add more.
It is interesting that she's not only Metic, she's masteress. She's from a master's generation, because all these edible confusions. And so the battle of the brother should distinguish the boundary between polis and outsider. This is a part of the hideous 7 against Tibor. And so there is a possibility for a demarcation between the two brothers. One is the hero, and other is against the police. But here comes the act of Antigone, because it is very important in ancient Greek. If the body is buried, this one is really being part of the police, of the memory of the police, and so on. I think she's outside the symbolic, outside the law. Not only Metics and foreigner, but even radical is her lack of representation and the possibility to do something in such a situation. But she found it. But she found, and this gesture could be named as a political gesture, not only aesthetical, sublime aesthetic of Lacan, not only maternal unwritten laws, the laws of blood and so on after Hegel, but of this.
Well, thank you for great presentations. I had a question about perhaps the nature of the Kristevan proposal that seems to be at work behind at least the first two papers. The nature, by the nature, I mean its promise and also its risk. I'm interested in the relationship between the promise and the risk of this proposal. It seems to me that the first two papers addressed a certain place, a place that is proper for a conversation to take place, and it's also a place where a coupling can take place. And this place can be, you can call it exile, you can call it the border, you can call it Ukraine, you can call it the place of the informant, among others, which generates this place, generates the conditions of possibility for the conversation or for the coupling that you were addressing. Now this, for Kristeva, this place is the place of psychoanalysis, or the place of transference and countertransference. It's the place also where a certain time comes in, which is the untime. So it's just as it's a no place, it's also a place with no time. And she also calls, you could say also that this same place is the work of art for Kristeva. So it's the work that art performs, is the production of this place and time. And you could also say that it is what happens here and then is a certain undoing. The effect of it is an undoing, in the sense of the death drive, perhaps, as she sees it. So, after that long-winded preface, is there a risk? Well, there seems to be a risk, both a risk and a promise, in encouraging this work of art to take place, even in the form of social policy. You can argue that. You can have a social policy that encourages this work of art understood as the creation of this place and time, that has a certain risk and a certain promise. So how do you approach the risk and the promise of this proposal?
Who's first? I'm not sure I'm approaching it. I've been trying to do in this text, which I had to shorten so much that I don't know what was really left of it. And in the previous text is, in a certain way, against the grain of things I did before, but also I've been in a sort of conversation with Kristeva about this, because she was more, she agreed more to what I did before, which was read the presence of a country of origin, or a mother tongue, or a biographical past, or whatever, a memory, in terms of the semiotics. So she would agree to this, and she wrote many pieces throughout the years about this presence of Bulgaria on the level of sensation and on the level of the semiotic. But what I'm interested in now is the political repressed and not only political but also intellectual. So it is my claim that there is a layer which is repressed, and from that point of view, it needs to be read through, or it could be perhaps best read through psychoanalytical instruments, but which really, when it is uncovered, does not relate to any sort of early childhood, infant, prenatal, whatever, remembrances on the level of sensations in skin and body and emotion, but on the contrary, so on the level of a political which has become unconscious. So it's not only, of course, it does not concern only her, because it's a big project. It concerns the both the post-communist East, but also the world at large. There was a huge experiment, a huge political experiment, which has been repressed, which hasn't been sufficiently integrated or worked through, or whatever we want to do with this. And this is why one comforting thought is that in many ways also working with the Holocaust and with the legacy of the Second World War began rather late. So it did not begin really immediately after the war. The really serious work, especially in terms of the guilt of Germany and so on and so forth, this work began in the 60s. So it came much later, and I believe there is a lot to be done here in terms of both what was good or what was bad in communism. And in this connection, I have a question to Julia, which is a political question, and the question is, aren't we facing really a political conflict, a political crisis, a political problem, which is the problem to choose between oligarchy, which is the manner in which both Russia and Ukraine used to be ruled. So it's the new regime which inherited the communist regime was oligarchy of an amazing scope. The wealth that some of these people have, it's really feudal proportions. So we have a clearly political conflict, which has been forced, which deviated into these new shapes of national, ethnic, and all sorts of other identities, which shouldn't be really the question here. So they're not really the problem. So this is something which takes us away from the real problem rather than resolving it. So it really turns aside the whole process into the wrong types of conflicts, and of course they will emerge, and this is how the whole thing will fail. So you're very optimistic, but I think it will be really hard.
And actually, your question connects perfectly to what I was going to say regarding the risk. I guess, so my focus on these issues of the transformation that I see happening on really individual level of selves, right? So not necessarily of institutions. My focus on this is driven by the realization that there is a great risk. For instance, from this point of view, what is happening in Ukraine at the level of government and society, it's true, it's a struggle between corruption, the immense corruption, and people who are sick of corruption. And in fact, again, a much longer version of my paper cites one of the slogans that I think is still hanging on Maidan, that says it's not about Europe, it's not about Russia, it's about corruption. And really, this is why the people came out there, because they were sick of it. But I mean, the way I want to, and of course there is a great risk. And in fact, what is so difficult about the situation right now is that people who are in power now are of the same blood, really, as the people who were there before. So in other words, nothing has changed yet. And and it's possible that nothing will change. And again, especially because of this impending danger of occupation, further occupation, I should say, which is really aimed at compromising everything, right, for all of these ideas that people stood for. So there is a great risk on that level, for instance, and why I've turned to these instances of individual transformation is because I think, if nothing else, at least we can say that something happened with the understanding of the people. So something has changed in the way people see themselves, and for instance, now it's part of the history that they spoke out, right? So if another situation emerges, they can fall back, the people can fall back on this and say, all right, we have done it once, we can do it again, or something like this. So in other words, it's already an important layer is being created. And I see these photographs that I showed with the signs of protesters as kind of small parts of this layer that is being created. So there are more dimensions to this, but to answer also the question about the risk, I think, yes, it's always, not only in Ukraine, in other situations, there is this great risk. But I think actually it's a good thing, because I think it is, this risk, it prevents these places from being co-opted and by, for instance, capitalist economy or something like this. So, they are, in other words, unpredictable. Dangerous, but this danger also, I think, provides this possibility that something new emerges, that, we cannot, is not part of what was, right? So something completely different. So I think the risk is very important, but it's also very frightening, right?
But it's promising.
I've been anxious for the past 4 months, so I try to find something to hold on to and say, okay, there's hope.
Sure, yeah, I'm going to try to be very brief because I'm not quite sure how to phrase this, so perhaps my words can catch traction and hopefully be generative, hopefully. Okay. Freud's Uncanny, right, entails, the character of Sigmund, right, who is the rational scientist who tries to help, Nathaniel out of his madness from visiting Spalzanosi, who is, also a historical figure, a Kabbalist of the same variety that Schelling was studying when he came up with these ideas of grounding and whatnot. I suppose what I'm getting at is it seems like the question, which Jacques Lacan in 1967 said, what is the petit object I? It is still the Jewish question, which is to say, how does one not ground one's desire? In other words, recognizing the violence of sublimation, and then honoring the Antigonian sort of negative sublimation. And I put the universal placeholder in its universal place, not to silence any other atrocity, but rather because this is the form of the absent center that determines the chloride itself, I think. In other words, I think Freud was asking himself this question in the Uncanny, and I think, you know, this is certainly, yeah.
So, is there a question?
Just how does one not ground one's desire then, understanding that doing so is already at the cost of a possibility, politically, psychically, otherwise? Or why is that a bad question? Or thank you so much for 3 great papers.
I think it's a good mantra, but it's difficult just to answer it in a minute, so I'll do it after that.
I can answer it. I mean, it's a very, not going to be a satisfactory answer, but you ground it in the abyss. I mean, I don't know. You know, I haven't really answered your question, but yeah. So somehow we have to I mean, at least I think there is a need to ground, but of course, you know, it cannot be grounded in on any ground, right? So it cannot be done in any way that would compromise the desire or the project, right? Does that make sense? So it has to be paradoxical. So there's a paradox at stake.
Perhaps what's remarkable about Antigone that this seems to be shown happening on stage, how it happens. So she does what she does from the position of an object, of the void. At least it's possible to see it like this.
It is connected with this catharsis process of the tragedy, and so we can think how this cathartic representation is apolitical, and not they are not killing each other. There is not Dionysus sparagmus, but representation, and so within it, this is a kind of distances, because you see at the end of the play, being in touch with the object, you become an object, because after Antigone, her object of desire, human saw her suicide and is involved in this continuous objection. After that, her mother heard about the situation and is also suicide. So
His mother.
But what is there outside of the Gestalt then, if not nothingness, right? Outside of the enframing, the stage. It just seems like that there has to be a new set logic or something.
There has to be a new one?
Set logic or something. Thank you.
Do you have a small question?
Speaking about risk, I wonder which is the greater risk, not to give up, to strive to be part of the world literature, or to come back to home, because coming back home is more risky.
I think I didn't say as much, but I thought events demonstrated that it was more risky. Well, Georgy Markov had at least a few more years before they killed him. Well, with Tsvetastianov, it happened very early. It's a dark story, but in a way it confirms Julia Kristeva's idea about writing as a martial art. So that's repeated suicide. So Tsvetastianov seems to incarnate with also biographically what happened in the conversations between Olga and Dan. Quickly put.
So please join me and give another round of applause to our panelists.